The Process, a podcast about creativity and experimental music. In the world of experimental music, outcomes and accolades for creators can be uncertain and at times seem far and few between. Therefore, creators and practitioners of experimental music must embrace the one thing they will always have complete control over: the process. This podcast aims to understand this creative process by listening to new works and discussing them with their creators. Each episode focuses on one creator and their music. Understanding how and why they create can inform aspiring creatives and help audiences better understand and navigate experimental music. I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and I'll be your host as we explore the world of experimental music, creativity, and the human need to find purpose in their world and lives. This is The Process. On today's episode, we speak with Jacob Cooper and Stephen Bradshaw. And both Jacob and Stephen are established in the new music industry. Jacob as a composer and Stephen as a performer. On today's episode, we'll listen to their collaboration called Sunrise. It got me thinking about this idea that there is a composer and there are performers. There's a hierarchy. And, we talk about all the things that maybe we want to move on from in the classical tradition. And there's some things that we desperately want to keep, or that some people find really important to preserve. And I wonder if hierarchy is one of those things that maybe is no longer of really any use or relevance. I think about some of the American experimentalist composers of the 20th century, classic folks like John Cage, Feldman. And, part of their compositional process was to remove themselves, or Cage often referred to, remove the ego from composition. I've always latched onto this idea of sort of relinquishing some of your control as a composer, relinquishing that control to the musicians, to the audience, to the greater good. Also, if we reference popular music, there's countless examples of composers, songwriters turned musicians, or musicians turned songwriters, or songwriters, composers turned producers. In popular music, there's so many examples of double duty or a breaking down of that hierarchy. I think a classic example is Brian Eno starting out as a member of Roxy Music, moving into not only creating music for David Bowie, but producing albums like the Talking Heads in the 80s, as well as working in the 90s, and at the same time creating his own ambient albums as well. So he was really all those things. He was a performer, composer, collaborator, producer, and idealist. So why should the new music world and why should the new music industry be any different? And I think a lot of people already believe this and are already practicing this. And truly, I think Sunrise with Stephen and Jacob is one of those true collaborations where you can hear how fluid that collaboration was. And today, We'll talk with Stephen and Jacob, and you can hear them explain how back and forth their process was, and how truly collaborative it was. The piece is fantastic. Both Stephen and Jacob, like I said, are well established and well known within the new music industry, and so hearing their opinions is always interesting and exciting. But hearing how they are sort of breaking the mold of that hierarchy within a piece like Sunrise, and how they're just creating a great piece of music through that collaboration, I think is really inspiring. And I think you'll enjoy today's episode quite a bit. So without further ado, let's learn more about Stephen and Jacob and hear a little bit of their piece, Sunrise. Jacob Cooper has been lauded as richly talented and a maverick electronic song composer by the New York Times and the New Yorker. His music has been commissioned and performed by such ensembles as the Los Angeles Philharmonic New Music Group, Eighth Blackbird, the Calder Quartet, and is released by Nonesuch and New Amsterdam record labels. The recording of his string orchestra work, Stabat Mater Dolorosa, was described by the New York Times as exhaustingly poignant and was an NPR Top 10 album in 2020. Stephen Bradshaw is a founding member of Variant 6 and The Crossing, a Grammy-winning vocal ensemble dedicated to new music. Stephen has appeared as a soloist with Bang on a Can, the Philadelphia Chamber Orchestra, and recorded and toured with Roomful of Teeth. He premiered Ted Hearn's Place At the BAM Next Wave Festival and will reprise his role in it with the LA Philharmonic. He also premiered and gave 300 performances of David Lang's Lifespan. Also a noted visual artist, Bradshaw has exhibited his work at a number of galleries throughout the country. On today's episode, we listen to Sunrise, a collaboration between Jacob Cooper and Stephen Bradshaw, with voice performed by Stephen Bradshaw and produced by Jacob Cooper. Additional performers include Destiny Battles on piano, Clara Kim, violin, and Tim Monroe on flute and piccolo. The album was released on Cold Blue Music in Venice, California. Jacob, we'll start with you. Where does the creative process normally begin for you, and how does that relate to the piece we're going to talk about today, Sunrise?
I've realized over the past few years that I'm really a timbral composer at heart. So, maybe when I first started writing, I would think of a melody and then some chords to go with it or something. But increasingly, my music is based on finding a sound that I think is interesting enough to last for a long time. And often to get that sound, I take some pre-existing source, whether that's, sampling something to an unknowable degree and processing it to an unknowable degree, or working with a collaborator like a performer. So in this case, it was really working with Stephen and having him come up with sounds that I would then process and liked.
And Stephen, is this normally how you begin a collaboration? Is it, are you usually just asked to kind of, I know in this process you were asked to just make some sounds and then those were processed. Is that normally how you're approached to do a collaboration?
Well, not really. I mean, in some ways this is a pretty atypical in the sense that it's sort of a return for me to, kind of stepping into the creative process and being part of like the forging of the piece. Because for me, I kind of have a duality as a creative artist, because I'm also a visual artist, like a dark surrealist painter. And that's kind of that area in which I kind of get things, out of me. But then I also have this thing where I'm chasing down, a composer's vision or a conductor's vision, and part of like a collective. And I kind of have those two sides to my career, and they both feed me in very different ways. So, and this was actually a really kind of gratifying departure for me in a way, where it was a really great thing to kind of return to the forging of new music, and having a hand in that was really kind of a novel thing for me.
Do you think so? I when you look at the credits on the album, it says, it has Jacob as the producer. So I never saw the word composer. And so I did want to talk about that. And then I saw Stephen as, I think it said voice or vocals or voice from Stephen. So was there a clear like performer composer situation here, or was it more fluid? Were you both the composers, or does it even matter?
I think we prefer not to really answer that. That's why we can answer it here in this case,
Yes.
but like in the context of the liner notes, that was, we actually, there's a lot of back and forth about this because maybe the first thing says the music by both of us. Like that's the thing that we feel the most comfortable with. But it is funny because people lag onto this producer thing and they're like, I felt like that was my performance. Jim Fox, the person who runs the label Cold Blue, suggested electronics initially for me. It was like as if I were performing electronics while Steven was doing voice. But for me, it's not like a performance thing. For me, the quote unquote performance is just really in the production that I was doing.
I feel like a good way to say it is that you kind of snapped a lot of stuff into a compositional framework. I feel like you were the nuts and bolts person, like where I would send you lots of, raw files of like kind of detritus and you would kind of, build this thing. And like the final product was kind of forged on your end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it is. And I'd say also that there are really like 5 different sections in this piece. And I think for each one, it was a little bit different of, like if we had to like, if we had the 5 movements, we could say like composed and performed, or like, public domain is 50% of this one and 0% of the other one. So it was like it's all super complicated. So we kind of just preferred
it's a super layered process, and it was really kind of slow cooked and over time the lines begin to blur.
Yeah, and even the distinction of what the heck you actually did, Jacob, like, was it electronics? Was it a computer? I mean, like, electronics today almost feels like, yes, there was electricity involved. Like, I mean, like, it can be that. And then computer just sounds odd because people don't see that as an instrument yet. Yeah.
Right.
But so there you are together doing this. So, and it talks a lot in the liner notes about this sort of rich back and forth that you had. So what was sort of the editorial process? So Stephen would create some sounds and send it to you, Jacob. What was the feedback then? You would create something, and then would Stephen then improvise on top of that? How was that back and forth process? And of course, it was all mediated through, I'm assuming, Zoom or virtually because of happening during COVID.
Yeah, we had a couple of Zoom meetings, mostly by email. We were sending stuff back and forth, or texting. But I think it was different for different sections. But I can remember, initially we started out with just having Stephen record the sheet music, the 1918 published sheet music, and that was this is like in the middle of the piece. Where there are these different sections that he sings, like these loops that repeat. And I think that was maybe the most straightforward creative one, where he would, he had these different phrases from excerpt from the original music. And some of them I think you edited, or, some of them you sang a little bit differently or improvised on them. And then I was like, oh, this is cool here. I'm going to layer this like this. And then he'd be like, oh, but can you do this? But, now sing it up a step and I'll put it in here, or now can you work with it that way? And then like the beginning of the piece is we found when Stephen was just doing some like noise experiments, and I was like, just sing the word sun in a lot of different ways. And he did this cool thing where you found like an overtone, Stephen, in your voice, or some like crackly.
I was like, and I think that's actually a really cool thing about the process too, is that being kind of at home and kind of looking for things and kind of surfing these really specific conduits of the voice is different than like kind of, having a piece and then going into a studio and being like, I'm going to deliver this piece now. It was much more like this kind of searching process. Yeah. Where a lot of it was like me for 3 hours going like, being as close to the mic as possible, like finding these little conduits of where my voice could speak differently.
Right. And I wonder if it was a traditional studio process where, you got the music, you practiced it several times, showed up for an hour or two, did it, got paid, went home. I wonder do you think a piece like this could have been developed in that in that format, or did it need a lot of this back and forth collaboration?
Yeah, definitely needed this in the open time too. Like Tony Creamer, the person who funded this project, and it was actually his idea to do this quarantine. He was like, the studio's open now. I can, give you guys time in there and everything. And we were like, that's great. But actually, this whole thing has worked with Steven just like recording random sounds for an hour and then me messing with them and then sending it back.
And I think it would have been an unrecognizable piece. If it had kind of gone in that more traditional route, I think the piece would be very different.
Very different, yeah. So like just close the loop on that beginning section. So Steven was singing the word sun with this crazy overtone sound, and then I reversed it and chopped it up and just took off the word to the S letter, so it was all un, and reversed it. So you just basically hear the un sound, and then put a bunch of those on top of each other with delay and different sounds. And then I like went back to him and I said, hey, can you do that, but now do it a step down or something like that. And now could you do that, but do them for longer and do them more, you crescendo more through them. So then he'd send me back 10 minutes of him singing sun in this crackly overtone voice. And then I would do that.
There's also there's probably enough material to build another 30-minute piece of all the like weird things I sent Jacob that didn't make it into the final cut.
Yeah. Sort of a library of sounds. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
So obviously the piece is done. I mean, it's done. It's been released. It's on the album. But how do you know, or how did you know when a piece like this is done, or when it was quote unquote right? How did you arrive? Did you know it had to be a 30-minute piece? So when you got to 30 minutes of music, it was done. How did you know the piece was done?
Well, actually, the commission was for a 10-minute piece, so
okay.
So we messed up on that front.
Yeah.
But
you over-delivered.
Yeah, we really did.
We got a full album. I think that we had these ideas for these different sections as we fooled around with things, and then it was about creating the cross feeds between the different sections. And I guess I still, sometimes I listen to it and I still feel like it could be longer, even though it's half an hour long. But I don't know. See, it seems sort of natural. I guess in times I've struggled with that. I mean, one thing that I have noticed over the years too, for me, is that a lot of my composition is needing to deserve, wanting things to go on longer and needing to make them interesting enough to go on longer.
Sure.
When I studied with David Lang in grad school, and one of the most important pieces of advice I ever got, it wasn't actually even direct advice. He was talking about his own piece, his percussion quartet, so-called Laws of Nature. And at a performance, the ensemble had only performed like the last two movements or something. And he was like, that doesn't work because the proportions are all off and you don't earn it. Like you need to be through something to earn the end of that music. And I feel like a lot of my music is like needing to go on long enough to earn the things that arrive. So I need to find out how to make it interesting enough to earn that.
Steven, with all this sort of back and forth, when did you know the piece was done?
There came a time where we kind of like closed the loop, where everything that was going to be performed had been performed, and we kind of had all the ingredients. And during the time when we were really closing that up, we were really communicating a lot at that time. And I think we, both of us had things we wanted to accentuate little flourishes, details. And one of the it was so great to work with Jacobs, is we really kind of get into those weeds, and we both really care about those little things. And so, it was in some ways it was a negotiation, a joyful one, but there was a lot of jockeying back and forth for like certain moments and things like that. And, we were, even after the process, which was a lengthy process of performance, but even after that, there was a long kind of afterlife of kind of getting it where we wanted, where we wanted the gain to be, what we, let's bring this out a little bit. Let's let this moment speak. Let's earn that moment. All that stuff was going on. And then eventually, when we either got the thing that we wanted, or we accepted that moment, that that one of us had a different vision for one of those moments. And you do at some point go, well, that's part of the process, is walking away as well. And I think we both walked away deeply gratified once the thing was fully cooked.
Well, let's talk a little bit about specifically, I mean, we've been talking about it this whole time, but let's talk specifically about Sunrise.
Over half of it is from Steven's voice, even the stuff that doesn't necessarily sound like a voice. And then there are a few samples of recordings that we kind of like them just passing in a whisper of The World is Waiting for the Sunrise, this tune that has been covered over, was written, I guess we haven't said this yet, it was written 100 years ago and during the first pandemic, and has been covered by tons and tons of musicians throughout the century. So there's some little wisps of those moments in there. And then there are places where I added software instruments. I guess it's all software. Yeah, software instruments to, I was like, oh, it'd be good to have a bass kind of sound in here. And then we did hire 3 performers, a pianist, Dynasty Battles, a violinist, Claire Kim, and a flutist, Timothy Monroe, just to get some extra sounds in there as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of the low end, and sort of there's this kick that happens at the start. I'm calling it, maybe it's an 808 kick. It's just a low end thing that's happening. And I noticed, traditionally how a kick would work, or a low sound like that would be to sort of establish some type of, repetition, or establish where the beginning of the measure is. I noticed at the start, it was really just sort of accenting the text.
That came out of Steven doing these different sounds where he's just alternating microtonally between 2 different pitches. But then we also layer the actual melody, like in the background. At some points, you can hear the actual melody that goes with those words. And then I've been very into sidechains lately. The dorkier listeners among you or audience will understand what a sidechain is. But
their ears just perked up.
Yeah. I was excited about sidechains. So I thought it was a cool technique to have that kick come in and just obliterate all the other sound.
That device that you're talking about, it kind of did create a different relationship to what the pulse was in the piece. Like, I feel like it functions a little differently than the average rhythmic device, in that it's kind of divorced from the pulse, but it's creating some kind of forward momentum.
Maybe can you talk a little bit about, either Jacob or Steven, about that sort of 10-minute section, that sort of middle section where we hear sort of just bits of the text being repeated and sort of layered?
This section kind of came first because, I sent along singing, a file of myself singing along with some other little arrangements and other kind of little elements. And it was kind of just this little mini arrangement of like the refrain that I sent to Jacob, and he kind of pulled it apart and kind of built this counterpoint out of the refrain. But that was the thing that we worked on for the initial kind of burst of the creative process. We worked on that piece and then kind of reframed it as we went along, and so it arrives where it arrives.
was that like exciting idea where you both were like, oh, this is, we need to build a piece around this?
I
It
think
was that
so.
moment?
Pretty
I
much.
feel like it's like when
Yeah.
we tapped a nerve there and we were like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, we found a little channel to swim down.
And I remember, so I remember him sending these beautiful triads because Steven's ability to blend his voice with his choral background is amazing. And I was like, we got to do something with this. So then we went to the text. We decided all the text, by the way, is from the original text. It's just, as you mentioned, spliced up and everything. So I remember being like, we got to keep those triads in. And then everything was sort of built around that. Like that's the basis. And then all these other clips come in on top of that. I am so dependent on a collaboration for creating music. I mean, this is, obviously a very good example of that, all the back and forth we had. But, as a composer, it's an incredibly isolated existence. And
It can be.
You get stuck in your own head about how something sounds and whether or not it's good. And also, I just get stuck with, creatively, like, what can I do here? So I collaborate a lot with musicians. And one thing we haven't really articulated yet is that a lot of my music lately has been leading towards this world of more workshopping and before the final recording, rather than like, the traditional idea of you write a string quartet and you hand it to them. Maybe there's like a little bit of workshopping involved, but increasingly I've been moving towards having people record stuff and then messing with it. So that was really great to do with this project to the nth degree. But then also poets, I work a lot with poets for text. And that's something that I felt very fortunate to do, the traditional idea again as a composer of working with a pre-existing text and not being able to change it. It's great to work with someone because you can sort of craft it the way you want it to, but also just the connection and the inspiration that you get from each other. And then I love working with visual artists as well. I haven't done as much of that lately, but video or, directors and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think it can be extremely isolating. It can be very transactional. And, maybe Stephen, you can kind of follow up on this as well. How gratifying is I've written this perfect piece, here's the notes, sing it. Like, is that still a gratifying thing for you, Stephen, in this sort of performance and creative process?
Yeah. I mean, it certainly can be. It's just one, it's one gear that you can shift into where you're chasing down a more kind of precise blueprint. But, something like this collaboration is great because, I was telling Jacob this last night at the bar that so what a great joy of this project was that his instincts surprised me a lot of the times. And so when we're kind of chasing down making this piece together, I would send him things and what he built out of it would surprise me. And then that would kind of, and I think we kind of goaded each other back and forth with our separate sets of instincts. And then you get to something you couldn't have gotten to on your own. You couldn't possibly have gotten to it that way. And again, I touched on this earlier, but, I enjoyed kind of both sides of that, of having that sort of devotion where I'm building something that's like, this is me, happy accidents aside, and like the kind of absence of true free will when you're creating something.
Yeah.
Aside from that, it's like it came from me. And there's, that's a great thing to kind of have. But it's also really great to work with people whose instincts surprise you and delight you. And as you build something that you couldn't have otherwise envisioned.
Well, Gentlemen, this has been fantastic talking about not only Sunrise, but also just your process. Before I let you go, though, where can we go to find out more about, first of all, Sunrise, but where can we go to find out more about each of you independently as well?
For Sunrise, the album is available on all streaming platforms, and you can check it out on Bandcamp and order CDs from Cold Blue Music if you're interested in that. And I have a website, jacobcoopermusic.com.
Yeah, for me, StephenBradshawArt.com. If you go there, you can have lots of performances and discography up there, and then also a large library of my images and my artwork.
Thanks to Stephen and Jacob for sharing their time and music with us, as well as their brand new release, Sunrise, on Cold Blue Music. If you enjoyed this episode, please check out other episodes in the series, and as always, like, subscribe, and leave a comment on your preferred podcasting app. I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and this has been The Process.